perfectionist and a purist about soaring flight. That was his whole thing, was soaring flight. So it didn't require a motor if you could launch from a high point. And if you did it from 3,000 feet, you could have up to 18 minutes of flight. You could do any maneuvers you wanted to. That's what Molyneux did. He was doing, he could even come up in altitude. If you took a dive up in altitude, he was doing figure eights, doing partial barrel rolls, and this thing was fully controllable. So then he announced he was going to do a public exhibition. This was at a ranch, by the way, Zappos Flights was a private ranch. They did it in seclusion for a reason. There was about maybe a dozen people at the ranch who saw this, including John invited over one of the physics professors to observe it, Father Bell. But so John immediately applied for a patent. And what's important here, aside the fact that he successfully got this patent and it's a successful flying machine, is here's this craft of 1885, the second liner. The shaded portion of the wing is the part that flexes. It works as a flap. It's controlled by the aviator. Okay. On this, he has two wings. However, these lateral edges are the part of the wing that are controllable. So here you have a technology from the 1880s that's being applied in a patent and was used in successful demonstration. Both, in this case, both the front and back wings have controllable aileron action. And it has a controllable tail as well. He gave the first, this is not the Santa Clara flight, but this is one of them in that period of time. Public exhibition, thousands of people there witnessing this. And this is just what they do is light a fire, fill the balloon with hot smoke, and the soot seals the fabric. It's a canvas fabric. Seals it up, and the air makes the thing lift. And so it's very tricky to do because as this thing lifts, it's this big cumbersome balloon with all these ropes, and this little frail lighter with the guy, and they have to get everything in the right position, let it go. Just the timing has to be done really well. If there's a wind, it gets dicey. So it was a very awkward way to do it, but he could do this, and nobody else could claim this at this period of time. This was reported all over the world, all over the country and all over the world. Here's Washington Times article on it, flying machine acts like a great bird. Here's a clipping from Scotland. Here's a clipping from London. There are examples of French. Here's a French journal article, a German article, another French article. I could go on for days with these things. It was widely published. Now, here we are, middle of 1905. At this point in time, California has made significant contributions to both classes of aviation, lighter than air and heavier than air. There's an article pointing out the most successful airships in the world at the time. California Air was right in the middle. Here's next, the first exhibition, aviation exhibition in America was the Aero Club of America, and Montgomery has a whole section over here showing his gliders and his public exhibitions. Here's an engraving showing the Baldwin parachute jumping method. And parachute jumping, nowadays most people don't even hear about this, but at the time it was huge at that period of time. Big impact. So fall of 1905, the Wrights finally, after 3 design major craft, sequence of craft, they finally get one that can reliably fly. They consider it practical. Fall of 1905, not Kitty Hawk in 1903. 1903, they struggled with that first machine. They couldn't really control it, and I'll explain why. So these guys are practical-minded guys. They're businessmen. That's part of their background, and mechanics. So they had this, once they got a practical craft, the thing was to do something to gain financial footing in this field, which is quickly opening up. And they were quite aware of Montgomery's progress at the time. April 1906, John was planning to set up a training station on the side of Mount Hamilton where they could launch, they would build a rail launching facility and launch gliders, and he would train a whole series of pilots. And he had backers in San Francisco who were going to fund this thing. And right at that moment, the 1906 earthquake hits and devastated San Francisco. It devastated the economy of Northern California for a long time. A lot of people don't realize that. Not just San Francisco, the whole economy. So his financial backing was gone, up in dust, up in flames. So he had to resort, he was teaching, so he had to resort to his controlled laboratory experiments. He did, however, he had quite a reputation nationally by now, and so a guy, Victor Lockheed, who's an engineer on the East Coast, had written about him. So he came out to California to meet him. He spent quite a bit of time at Santa Clara College. Here's Victor Lockheed. And Lockheed was given the same training that Baldwin was given. And it was a training he couldn't get anywhere else at Santa Clara College. And so he went back, he wrote a book, a very popular book, Vehicles of the Air. You go on the internet and look this up and you'll see it was very popular this day. Sold something like 30,000 copies, and everybody had a copy of this book who was interested in aviation. It had plans in it. Featured Montgomery prominently throughout the book. So his younger brothers, just like all these other guys, they were in the automotive field. They were mechanics and designers, and their brother now had this expertise from Montgomery, so their brother helped them design their first airplane, which is the G1. Everybody reads about that if you look it up. That's their first, it was a seaplane, first airplane, and they gave paying rides at the Panama Pacific exhibition in 1915, and that's what they're kind of initially known for. They went on to become major aircraft designers and manufacturers of the Lockheed Aircraft Company. That's these two guys, Victor's younger brothers, Alan and Malcolm, are Lockheed, were the founders of Lockheed. So it's an example, and there are many other ones of Montgomery interacting with somebody who imparts that knowledge on somebody, a younger, mechanical-minded person, and suddenly their career goes from mechanics into aviation very quickly, within maybe a year, year and a half. There's many examples of this. The Lockheed brothers are just yet another one. Here's just an example of how popular in our culture the California Aero is. Here's a 1907, an exhibition in St. Louis, and there's an airship down here, one here. You can't see this one. But all these ships are just duplicates of the California Aero. So this airship, this is the template for airships in America for a good 6 or 7 years, using ideas borrowed from Montgomery, from Curtiss, and then some of Baldwin's innovations, all of it being credited to Baldwin. But then these other guys, Lincoln Beechey and Roy Davenport, became very prominent in their fields, and they too were benefiting from this knowledge. So here's sheet music, here's a fruit piece label, here's another one, there's sheet music of songs that were written on the theme, all of them basically showing the California Aero. So it really had an impact on our culture. 1907, this group gets together under Alexander Graham Bell, who's right here. Glenn Curtiss now is an expert in aeronautics. They hire him, they get this group together, they form a corporation, and they decide they're going to start, they're going to try to build the power aircraft. All of them were actually going to each have their own projects and try to get in the air. So initially, since Curtiss was hired as their chief engineer, he brought along Baldwin. So Baldwin shows them how to build a glider. So they build a glider and they start practicing with it, and that's what everybody did back then, is they build a glider, get familiar with how this thing works, and then they build a powered aircraft, just basically duplicating either a Curtiss machine or a Wright Brothers machine or one of the other ones, French machines. So this group started building aircraft, but what's important here is that another example of a fellow who's able to become prominent in aviation who just a few years before was in a completely different field. It's instant expertise in an unrelated field. So now, 1908, this is when the Wright brothers went public. A lot of people think they went public in 1903 and their story starts in 1903. In terms of their impact, it starts in 1908 when they went public. They'd been working, once they got a practical machine, they set it aside, they started doing negotiating, and they tried to get governments to buy licensing rights. They tried to do manufacturing arrangements, and they tried to set up training programs in Europe, and they also started negotiating with the U.S. government for producing the first military aircraft. So they had their hands in a lot of pies, and Octave Chanute by now is starting to look askance because throughout this whole period of time, he's corresponding with the Wrights, he's visiting, he's sharing his expertise with them, he's critiquing their work, their findings, he's suggesting ideas, he's giving them the latest and best data and literature, and he's helping them along transition from being businessmen, bicycle mechanics to being aeronautical experts. At no point in time did they ever acknowledge this publicly, though. So they went public in 1908 they were really just carrying out contracts that they had arranged. And that was the whole point of their going public. They exploited the potential of aviation. It was initially through a public relations campaign. They wrote articles, they gave interviews, and it was all about Kitty Hawk. It's the beginning of their success. That craft was the first airplane, first successful airplane. The first time they flew it, they were by definition the first to fly. And the technology behind that machine was their intellectual property. And anybody out there who's flying, by now a lot of people were, in machines that had nothing to do with the Wright Brothers, anybody who's flying is using our technology, the idea that we came up with. They're using that, and they need to cease and desist. So, the Wright Brothers' self-promotion takes a decided twist from reality. Through original scientific research, two genius inventors absolutely independently unlocked the secret to one of the most important technological advances of the modern age. Flight. Cue angelic music. I don't have angelic music, I just... So anyway, spontaneous invention in a vacuum and predating success. How does, anybody of you who've read about invention, you come to realize how it happens. The process is very complex, it has many legs, and there are people who are working in parallel who don't know one another. There are people who share ideas, there are people who borrow ideas like Baldwin. There are people who are given ideas like Lactate and they share it. So invention in an area that's important, like the telephone or flight, it's a very daunting undertaking, and it takes a lot of ideas and talent, trial and error, and engineering and science, and it doesn't come from two bicycle mechanics in Dayton, Ohio. That is not real. It's not realistic at all. So the other thing about predating their success, they were successful in the fall of 1905 as far as finally being able to fully control the craft. But they claimed when they went public that their success dates back to 1903 because that steps back behind anybody else, including Montgomery. And so this became accepted. They were promoting this everywhere. They became very famous because they went public, and they were ahead of everybody else, that's for sure. No question about that. But they said that they were the first to fly in the fall of 1903 at Kitty Hawk. You read Orville's journal, and throughout this project, whenever we had a question, we went to the primary sources. We never bothered with these books that were written by PhD historians or whoever. You go back to the original material. There, it seems to me that Orville's journal of December 17th of 1903 might be a good place to go. You read the description, you can't read it from there, but I'll tell you that they made 4 flights. They're straight flights. They went like this. 2 of those flights crashed before they could, they crashed. 2 of them crashed. They were able to fix the craft and start again. They were never under full control. These were not sustained flights. But their claim when they went public, what justified their saying they invented flight and that they were the first to be successful is that Kitty Hawk 1903, they made the first controlled, sustained, powered flights. The only thing that's true there is powered flights. They were not sustained or controlled. Montgomery's were controlled. They were sustained as long as gravity would keep them going. But so this is what we call making facts up to make your success seem a lot more significant than they were. But it's all about ownership of technology. Turn this thing on. Yeah, I did. I got so excited here. So the Wrights, right, this is still 1908, they produced this craft and they gave exhibitions in front of the military, and they were awarded the contract for the first airplane, military airplane in American history. Blake Curtis at the same time flies his Junebug and wins a national competition put up by the Scientific American public. It's the first public flight. Then Baldwin has now got a huge airship, and he also enters into a competition with the military. So this is actually the first military aircraft in American history. They adopted this first, then the Wright aircraft was adopted second. So these guys were into it for the business, for the financial reward. This wasn't science. Science was involved in it, but it wasn't their science. The Wrights then, in the fall of 1905, joined with Wall Street, notorious robber barons, one of the more unkind words. They're capitalists, and they were all known for establishing trusts, monopolies. So they capitalized the Wright Company, and they had these guys on the board of directors, and they started going out And I'm sure that the backroom meetings were all about, look, we have a patent covering this technology, it's our technology, and anything out there that flies is required, they can't fly unless they're using our invention. It wasn't true, but it probably sounded good to the investors. And they also said, society has a moral obligation to reward us for our work, for our success. They only wanted a small piece of the pie, which is what monopolies are all about. The elephant in the room is that this is just, it's fantasy. It's really fantasy. It just ignores the way invention happens. It requires that they make up stuff and manipulate their story. And what's unfortunate is that if you look into their personal correspondence, you can actually figure out what's going on in their life in reality. But the public face they're putting on is a very different thing, and nobody has any way of confirming what they're saying. They're now famous. They're being given broad forums to talk to the press, and they're also doing this using the court cases that they're initiating to promote these very unrealistic ideas, and it's all about them. And so it's entirely self-serving. And it's just this very convoluted story. But what I realized late in the game is that nobody would be able to have gone in there and really find out the true backstory until many decades later. This story was already well established and was part of the narrative in the literature, long since. And finally, their papers became available in 1950. You go into those papers, now you can get it on access to it online. And there's all kinds, I wouldn't say smoking guns, there's a lot of smoldering guns in there though. And they didn't clean out their papers very well, they probably should have. But there's a lot of stuff in there that really draws a lot of questions. It contradicts what their public stances were. 1910, a group got together in Vienna and they studied. They wanted, just like everybody else, let's build some gliders, and based on that experience, let's go and build something like a sailplane or something and start manufacturing. So they studied the literature, they came up with three, what looked like the most promising designs. One they called the Montgomery, there's the Chanute, and then there's the Lilienthal. Chanute, Lilienthal is another guy, a very important German experimenter. And so with these three, they did an international soaring competition, which means that the top of the mountain was in Switzerland, or it was in Austria, the bottom was in Switzerland and France. Top of the hills in Switzerland, the bottom hills in France. So if you survived, you did an international soaring competition. Most of them did. I don't know about this guy. This is the Montgomery. They decided after doing this that the Montgomery showed the most promise. It's got some modifications, and it apparently uses weight shifting for control and not a controlled system.
Human landing gear.
Yeah, well that's what they did. That's what they did. There were no landing gears prior to about 1908 or so. All Montgomery's, his pilot would come in and flare the back wings and use the tail and bring the thing up and land lightly on his feet. So that was ideally, that's why it was so important to have control. If you didn't have perfect control and you came down, it's like they say, that trip down is just fine. It's that sudden stop that mess things up. So how these guys did this, I would never do this. You have to be nuts. Anyways, so John was engaged in other areas of invention, successful invention, and he came up with this electric rectifier. I won't get into what that is. It's sort of off to the side. But he sold the rights to it and got quite a bit of money out of it. So he decided, finally he had the money to not only start doing some serious R&D again, but he now was a respectable fellow. He had financial stability. So Regina Clary was still around, and he came back and courted her, and they married in this April of 1910. They actually closed the church in San Francisco. St. Mary's. They actually closed that for their wedding, which is, the family had a lot of pull with the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. So this is great. I found a book on eBay 6 months ago. John took his own copy of Victor Hotlaki's Vehicles there, and he inscribed it to her and gave it to her as a Christmas present. This is before they got married, so he refers to her, he's speaking to her just, a woman, not as his wife, or even his fiancée. So this came up on eBay. So with this money and with this woman now supporting him and encouraging him to start flying again, he built this pretty advanced aircraft in early 1911. And this thing's interesting because this is all fixed back there. None of this is controllable. It's a cambered elevator. This is a vertical rudder. It stays stationary, and then all of the control is in this large wing. It's a flexible wing, and so all of his control is in that wing. And he has a, initially he used 2 levers, but then he switched to a little steering wheel, and it had little buggy wheels on it, because nobody was manufacturing this kind of stuff back then. Not yet, at least. So he made, in San Jose, southeast San Jose, the Evergreen District, they made a series of flights in over a period of a week. He hired not only a mechanic, but a co-pilot, Joseph Vieira, and they were making all these flights, and this thing would actually, it would soar, it would ascend, and he could land off on the side on the top of the ridge again, take off from a higher ridge and land, come back up and land on the side ridge. It was a really efficient aircraft design, quite advanced design for the time. So they take this thing up the hill, they put it on a little tiny track, take it up the hill, and turn around and go down, and that velocity going down that track, the wing would catch lift and the thing would take off and they'd fly. They'd go several hundred yards for each flight. And so on one of these, I guess John, in his early 50s, he was out of shape. And they kept throwing this thing up the hill. It was hot. October can be very hot in southeast San Jose. And I think he was just exhausted and probably a little dizzy. Took off, the thing lifted up, and a gust of wind hit him, and he lost control. And the thing landed on the ground, dropped about 25 feet, and he fell through the framework and was injured internally in the skull. And he lived about 3 hours, and he died of his injuries. And his wife was just devastated because they'd only been married a short while. And this was like his chance to get back out there again and fly. So, as sad as it was, a lot of people came out publicly and talked about his achievements and what his contributions were, really acknowledged this guy was into it for the science, not a greenhead, like a few brothers we know of in the middle part of our country. So later, the family afterwards sued the federal government over patent infringement. Long story there. At the end of it, they lost the case. Orville Wright and the Wright Brothers patent was involved in the case to a degree. And Orville used, from that point onward, Orville used the outcome of that case as a larger judgment on Montgomery's work. So here, Montgomery's work contributed nothing to the art of flying or the science of aerodynamics. Any of you have that impression by now? Not true at all, but Orville Wright said it, and the Wright Brothers said a lot of things, and when they said things, they were taken on their word. So Orville Wright's position on Montgomery, this is in 1944, over 3 decades after Montgomery's passing. Orville Wright was able to impact the literature. So in 1946, Gallant Journey was made, a motion picture by Columbia. During that period of time, a series of articles were written, the Montgomery myth. It was all a myth. It didn't actually happen. Montgomery never flew before the Wright Brothers. In 1950, they established a wing at the site of the first flights in San Diego County. In that same period of time, in the midst of aviation, early gliding experience of John G. Montgomery Art, evaluated against the background of 7 decades of progress. In other words, it's a myth. He didn't do anything, he didn't fly before the Wright Brothers. That same year, they changed the name of the largest small craft airport in the country in San Diego to Montgomery Field. Same period of time, Montgomery's Great Glide Aviation myth. Early 1960, they established the John J. Montgomery Award. They gave to the X-15 test pilots, a number of them. No retort at that time. Later, a book is put out, The Montgomery Myth, The Flight That Never Was. It goes on and on over time. Every time there is an attempt to acknowledge Montgomery or memorialize him, there's a pushback from a Wright Brothers biographer or a Wright Brothers advocate. It's very political. And here's the whole listing. On the left is something that's done in favor of Montgomery. On the right is unfortunately, this thing got out of whack at some point. It was all lined up. So all this is happening over time. It's happening over and over and over. My co-author and I finally had our fill. And in 2010, the University of Oklahoma published Quest for Flight. I still don't have angelic music. So this, getting back to our original slide, you'll never see this in any book, anywhere, any article, that the Bay Area had all these pioneering achievements and contributions. to that pioneering period. Sure, after 1908, everybody was doing stuff all over the place. And most of the books, that's when California comes into the picture. About 1910 is when California comes on the radar. But you can go all the way back to the 1860s to find these pioneering accomplishments, men and women, way before the books even mentioned it. It's real. So when you fly at either the Oakland airport, the San Francisco airport, or the San Jose airport, you're flying through historic airspace. That's it. We do have books for sale. I'm going to donate some of the copies to the Friends of the Library so they can sell them in their store. Oh, any questions? Any Wright Brothers fans? I'll hide.
There was probably no surprise then that the slopes of Mount Hamilton became just about the soaring capital of the western United States for a long, long time.
He saw that potential. He understood the kind of location and the prevailing winds that were needed for a good location. He learned that back in San Diego. So San Diego is also that lighting location. He had a couple of lighting locations. They were facing west on a slope at the top where you could launch into the wind. The bird, you watched the birds. You got the hints from the birds. They were doing it for a reason. Yeah.
So, one of the books that I didn't read in the book group that fortunately one of my book group co-members is here. It's entitled The Wright Brothers, and it's by, I guess, David. Yeah, he's famous for doing these books about great inventors.
Right, he's a very accomplished writer, won a bunch of awards. I've read this book. It's pretty much like instant soup. You know, there's very little real original research. He's basically taking all the other Wright Brothers biographies and sort of borrowing from a lot of that secondary source material, and he's putting it out in a more skilled way. Not that it isn't a good book, but he's perpetuating the same kinds of myths. The same bad actors are called out in there who aren't really bad actors. The Wright Brothers are the overwhelming victors, just all the usual stuff. I call it the usual suspects. Yes?
The fellow that kept spewing, Babbage or
Baldwin.
Baldwin,
Yeah.
how did he live out his life?
Well, he's one of the most interesting characters in aviation history. He, not only was he pioneering parachute jumping and stimulating a whole generation, but then he went into ballooning and was very famous and influential with that. Then he went into, eventually he went into powered aircraft and was also, so he had a pilot, he was the only person who had a license, an official license as a balloonist, as a airship guy, and as a pilot, and as a heavy-ridden air pilot. And a fascinating character. He's like the guy in the musical and the movie, not Carousel, the Music Man. Yeah, who's the actor? He's that guy. He comes to town and he just manipulates the situation, and he'll say anything to get you to believe him. And he's great. To read his interviews, he's just all over the place. He's really very entertaining guy, but he was brilliant at recognizing the potential in something and exploiting it effectively. And that's this story about 1903 is when it all starts getting really dynamic and these characters start coming in out of nowhere, out of the woodwork. We're doing something else, suddenly they're experts in aeronautics. And it's because they're jumping on an opportunity, they're big borrowing and stealing, and they are taking advantage of it. And so in our book, about midway through, that's when it really gets rolling like a snowball with all these guys coming and going. And that's what's great about his story is that in order to tell a story, these guys are coming in and he's interacting with them. And it's just like the guy who cues the pool table and the balls just start going everywhere. It's a really interesting part of the story. It's really fun writing that part of it. The second half is particularly interesting. Yes?
So do you think history will be rewritten?
No, it just doesn't work that way. There's too many, it's too indoctrinated into the literature. However, we've had a lot of attention for the book. We've gotten a lot of professional reviews. We've had some people change their minds. We had the San Diego Air and Space Museum, which was always heavily biased against Montgomery, finally turned around and said, oh, I think you guys did it finally, in the book. It was so exhaustively researched, and just a third of the book is our primary sources. So they actually created Montgomery exhibit in the lobby of the museum recently. Yes.
Yeah, we were just there, I was just gonna comment, we were there this last summer.
Yes, did you see the little?
There it is, yes.
So my co-author built
Yes.
those little glider models,
Yeah.
and that's the first time anybody has ever attempted to build models based on Montgomery's drawings.
At the Balboa Park,
Yeah.
the museum there.
So
Great
we
place.
supplied a lot of the stuff for it. They had their own stuff too in their archives. And then there's the original manuscript that I mentioned is right there in that glass case, and our book's there too. So yeah, that came out basically because of our book. We talked to enough people got the aha moment and said, okay, we need to change our attitude here. This is a real deal. This is no longer we can't just accept this mythical stuff.
We were there, if you walk in, we were there during the Da Vinci exhibit.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, you see Montgomery's things, and you walk back and there's Da Vinci
Right.
long earlier, and
Yeah.
holy smokes.
Yeah. So there's a lot, but history is a lot more interesting than the way it's presented. It's presented in literature in a very simple, formulaic way, from book to book to book. Doesn't matter if they're PhDs or what. They all take the same approach. And people have done that with Montgomery too. And we just pushed all that stuff aside and decided to just research raw primary source material for several years and just run through it and try to understand what it's saying. And so that's how we did our book. That's why it's so different and so it's coming at you from such a tangent from what you've heard and understood. Yes?
How was it that, is it Wilbur's diary was not known until, what, did you say the 50s or something?
Their whole collection of private papers and journals and diaries were kept privately. First, both the brothers had them, and then Wilbur died in 1912, and Orwell took on his collection, kept it in his files, and he guarded it. He didn't let people have access to it. So even when the first Wright Brothers biographer in 1940 was given permission to write their story, and Orwell was going to approve it, Orwell controlled what he had access to. He didn't want him to be citing any of this stuff. So when Orwell passed away in 1948, it took a couple of years, the family donated the collection to the Library of Congress. So now you can go in there for the first time in history in 1950, you could go in and see what they're not saying publicly. And it's really interesting to go through that stuff. It's fascinating because they're being contradicted all the time. And Chanute's personal role in their success is really obvious when you get to read their literature, when you get to read their collection. But it's not something they ever acknowledged publicly. It was all about the Wright Brothers. They owned it all. It was completely their ownership.
Is this going to be a movie?
There are some people who want to do a movie, but they haven't been able to get the funding all together yet. The screenplay is being written by a group in the Bay Area. But it was done as a movie in 1946. It was done in a 1940s way of doing movies. It wasn't done as a documentary or particularly accurate. It was done, parts of it were done really well. They recreated some of the flights, really beautiful flying scenes. Because the director was an aviator, he understood.
Great story.
Yeah, it's a great story for sure.
Something like Eastwood, what you call it.
Yeah, well, if you know them. I don't have any luck with these people. They won't listen to me. So, anybody who wants to buy a book, it's only $15. It's not self-published. It's University of Oklahoma Press. And they put out really excellent peer-reviewed books. They really put us through the ringer in vetting it. So.